All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Senator Warren, and our panelists, and thank you, David, for creating this opportunity. My name is Rachel Miller. I'm a city councilor here in Providence, Rhode Island, and before I was on the city council, I was a community and labor organizer. So this topic is especially near and dear to my heart. Outsized corporate power it's at the intersection of so many issues. It's our fight for fair wages, for economic autonomy for ourselves and our families, for safe and affordable housing, racial equity and justice, our health, from healthcare access to environmental justice to reproductive rights, and well beyond. And that's why I'm here supporting David Segal in his campaign for Congress. I've known David for nearly 20 years when he was on the city council himself. I got to work with him when he became a state legislator, and over the last decade as he's helped move this work at the national level. David is uniquely qualified to push back against monopoly power and to broaden and build that fight to put power back in the hands of the community. So if you haven't already gotten a chance to, please donate, whether that's $1,500 or $150 or $15 or anywhere in between. It will make a huge impact. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about the growth of monopoly power, how that manifests, how it affects our lives. We're also going to talk about our own power, how we build it and grow it in response. We'll hear from Senator Warren and David Segal, and then we'll have a chance to hear from Rhode Island and national panelists before we close. It is my great honor to introduce Senator Elizabeth Warren, someone who I think hardly needs an introduction. Senator Warren is one of the great progressive voices of this moment. She organizes fearlessly for a fair economy and on so many issues that impact our lives and are a deep part of this conversation today. Senator Warren, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thanks for being here and getting us going. And let me just say hello, Team Segal. I really wish we could do these in person, but I'm afraid we're going to have to do this by video. I never thought I'd get into politics, not in a million years. But when I did, I quickly found out that nobody makes it on their own, especially in the fight for big structural change to our economy and to our democracy. That if you're going to do good, the kind of good that actually changes people's lives, changes power structures, then you need partners who aren't afraid of a good fight. And that is why I am here today with David. I've worked with David Segal on plans to level the economic playing field. We've worked to support a responsible foreign policy, and we've worked to build a government that Americans can trust to work for them. Like me, David is a deep believer in the fact that personnel is policy, and he's fought in the trenches with me and with others to get economic policymakers who have real ambition about what we can do to rebuild the middle class and put them in positions of power in Washington. He has fought against concentration. He's fought against the corruption that has brought our economy and our government to where it is today. David has been in this fight. He is just the kind of fighter I love. A moral, principled man who knows how to fight and knows how to win. I see it right now as we are in an uphill battle to hold on to our majority, to expand it in the House and the Senate, and to create an economy and a government that breaks this cycle of greater and greater concentration, more and more corporate power, and instead a government that works for everyone. If we don't do this, our nation is in real trouble. But I'm here because I'm fundamentally optimistic. I believe that we can win, and I believe that we can make a difference. But to do that, we need candidates, we need leaders like David. We need David making decisions at policy tables, the decisions that help govern our economy and our government. So I'm just proud to be here today, proud to be in the fight, shoulder to shoulder, along with David. And with that, let me just introduce a true fighter, a true champion for working families, David Segal. Take it away, David.
Thank you so much for being here, Senator, and to all others who've joined us today. I have been following your work since the mid-aughts, since before you ever ran for office, and so your support is particularly meaningful to me, and your presence here. The issue we're talking about today touches on almost literally every single facet of our lives. So the conversation today is necessarily not going to be comprehensive, but I'm going to try to blaze through a few key points and then ask you a couple of questions about where we go from here. And so, to say the least, it's clear that we live in challenging times, and it's more important than ever that we do more than just call out corruption in corporations and the far right. We need to win elections. Like, winning elections is the only way that we're going to be able to fix our country's problems. And to win elections, we need to do more than just be better than the other side. We need a clear agenda that helps middle class and working class and lower income people. And we need to look for points of commonality around which we can build broad coalitions and deliver wins for everyday people. And I think corporate power concerns are a place where we have notable ability to do just this. And we need to be honest about the corrosive influence of corporate spending in our political system and not just say, oh, well, that's how the game is played, because working families know that they lose every single time the game is played that way. And Senator, I'm so excited to have you in particular because you've long stood for exactly those principles. And I think since before you ever first ran for office. And so I was hoping I could start a bit by talking about how we got here. And if you're willing to give me a couple minutes to wind up, I'll then ask you
Absolutely.
or two. So I'm just struck always, and particularly profoundly this week and over the last couple of weeks as we've seen the end of the Supreme Court session, by the sophistication of the right-wing project over recent decades and the limited equivalent organizing and sometimes muted response from progressives, at least until recently. And the right has implemented a generations-long strategy to take over and shape the federal government in service of corporate power. And that's also intertwined with reactionary social and civil rights politics. And it's multifaceted. There's no way to reduce it to a couple of key points, but I'm going to try here and focus on three elements of the program where I think the right's had particular success, but where I think we're beginning to respond. And these are matters I've confronted as an advocate and are also priorities for me should I be elected to Congress. So first, there's a focus on building pipeline of what you might call fusionist judges who sit at the conjunction of corporatism and right-wing social policy. So we have a pact between economic libertarians and hard right social conservatives to populate the court with people who are going to strip away civil rights of everyday people. And just in the last week or so, we've seen this around Dobbs and Roe and with some Voting Rights Act cases and beyond, while also enshrining the rights of corporations to do whatever they want. And moreover, this pact means that you have people who have conservative, religious, and social beliefs voting for an economic agenda that they might not otherwise support. Second, there's an effort to, let's say, decapitate Congress. And this was a key facet of the Gingrich project. Congress loses expertise. It becomes a more difficult place to work in. Staff pay goes down. We eliminate functions like the Office of Technology Assessment. And so expertise and the void therein is filled by lobbyists and the right-wing think tank ecosystem, and becomes easier for K Street to capture staffers who can't raise a family on $45,000 or whatever. And third, we have a focus on installing an ideological executive branch. And you, of course, Senator, have in recent years popularized the notion that personnel is policy, and that we need the right people in place in order to get the right policy outcomes. But I think one thing that's so interesting, given how much this is associated with your great work, is that the phrase came to prominence during the transition into the Reagan administration. Mm-hmm. And I think was first coined by his personnel director, Scott Faulkner. And it was part of an effort by the hard right Reaganites to push out more moderate Republicans. And I'm reminded by a quote of a conservative intellectual, I can't remember exactly whom, and the quote might be like vaguely apocryphal, but it was something like, isn't it concerning that conservatives have so little purchase in the academy? And he responded by saying something like, well, I'm not so worried. We'll just go run the government instead. And so for the last 40 or 50 years, that's what they've done. And they've had great influence even in Democratic administrations. So here we are living with the legacy of all of this more clearly than ever, I think, over the course of the last couple of weeks. And so now I have a compound question for you. First is just, would you agree with that, broadly speaking, as an analysis of how we got here? And do you think that we're beginning to see signs that we're at least starting to shift the dynamics or have the potential to, and what might be some paths forward?
So yes, I think that you put your finger on it when you talk about this alliance between not just social conservatives. Can we just sharpen that a little bit on really extremist social conservatives and the corporatists? And they figured out, both of them, that in a straight up go to the American people and say, this is what I stand for. I really want to reduce regulations on giant corporations. I want the big ones to be able to be have total market control and operate like monopolies. They're going to lose. And the same thing is true for people who just stand up and say, I'm going to run on Roe versus Wade, and I'm going to run, turning it over. I'm going to run on making sure that the government intrudes on whatever happens in someone's bedroom. They can't win those, or couldn't, for 10, 20, 30 years. So they use the courts as a place to go. And it really was an alliance between the two, money and organization and energy. And the two pushed over and over and over. And we watched the Republicans do the wink, wink, nod, nod as one nominee after another comes in that has been pre-screened, says all the right things in front of the American people. Roe versus Wade is settled law. Precedent is really important. And then as soon as they get the votes, they're gone. I see this as the moment that we really have come to the fork in the road. And one of two things is going to happen. Either the Republicans are going to seize complete control. They're going to get control of our federal government. And if they do, Clarence Thomas, Mitch McConnell, Mike Pence have told us exactly where they want to go. They are not content just to overturn Roe versus Wade. They want to ban abortion all across the country. They're coming after LGBTQ rights. They're coming after contraception. And it never gets elevated in the same way, but they're doing the same thing on the corporate side and have already done a big part of it. Elevate money, elevate the influence of corporations, all pushing in the same direction, and undercut voting rights. Because if the majority rules, none of this stuff would happen. Mm-hmm. So that's the package on the right. But here's the reason I have this seed of optimism. And that is, we turn this in the other direction. We get in this fight for the next 4 months and a week, and we just pound it. And if we can keep the House, maybe even expand our majority a little bit, but just keep the House and get 2 more Democratic senators who will get rid of the filibuster, then all of a sudden it all starts, the dominoes start to fall in the other direction. And it's Roe versus Wade, and it's voting rights, and it's climate, and it's strengthening again the role of government to be a check on these giant corporations. It's once again getting a government that doesn't just operate for those who already have money and power, but a government that really is about the investments in our public schools, about a progressive tax system, and how those pieces fit together. So I think that was the answer to both parts of your question, and that is, yeah, we see this the same way, but I also see there is a path out of this. We're not guaranteed to win it. Shoot, it's going to be hard. Nobody says this is downhill and easy sailing. But there really is a path out of this. That's why I'm here with you today. That's why I want to see you strong in this fight, representing the Democrats in Rhode Island, and then coming to Washington, not to do years more of same old, let's just not rock the boat, let's help out business. We want to be business friendly, which is a code word often for the monopolists instead of the small businesses. It's that you're there, you know what you want to fight for, you've got the vision, and personnel is policy, not only in the people we appoint for these roles in the administration, but also for the people who represent us in Congress. So yes, David, and you are what make me optimistic that we can get this done.
Thank you very much. Do you have another minute or two for?
Sure. Yeah, I got a few more minutes here.
Okay.
I'm good.
One thing that is interesting to me, and this comes up in the context of my race, is of course we feel very polarized as a society right now, but there are also these moments of commonality, and the polarization in some ways is a function of the media ecosystem, the social media ecosystem, and so on. But we have these moments where we see broad support for what you or I might call like progressive populist policies around certain economic considerations. I think that your wealth tax proposal, for instance, has at least plurality support even among Republicans in polling that I've seen.
Yep.
That doesn't map to members of Congress necessarily. But we do see around these questions of monopoly broad support on the ground in terms of the rank and file electorate, and that actually even manifesting in terms of who's in office. For the most part, when we try to build a majority around anti-monopoly legislation, we're getting mostly Democrats, but there's a non-trivial number of Republicans who agree with that. And we saw, Lena Khan is now the FTC chair. She got 22 or 24 Republican votes. So I'm wondering why you think this is, and also if you could speak to just the purchase that this particular issue has in elections in swing districts or districts that might be particularly vulnerable right now because of the broader political dynamics across the country.
So you put your finger on something that I think is just fascinating, and it echoes throughout our system right now, and that is that a pretty large majority of Americans want to see us crack down on monopolies, want to see us confront price gouging head on, understand that corporate power is running roughshod over their lives. And yet, you'd think in a democracy, when you're getting 60, 70, 80% of Americans saying, yeah, I'm strongly for that, you would think that that would mean that a representative government would pass those laws, strengthen those regulations, and get it done. And I think this goes to the core corruption of the system right now. And let's just be blunt about it. A big part of this is just money. And when I say money, it's money in 50 different ways. The one that comes to mind, of course, immediately is money in terms of campaign contributions. But it's so much more than this. It's the money that funds attacks on anyone who steps out of line. So the Supreme Court helps out here by permitting dark money to pour into our elections. And that means these so-called independent political action committees can just beat the tar out of anyone who doesn't follow the corporate line. Or pick another one, money on what happened with taxes. Not only were there huge tax breaks for the wealthy, that was the one thing that Trump got done. And I don't know if you remember at the time reading the things where there were various congressmen who actually stood up in the Republican caucus and said, hey, I've had my donors calling and saying, if we don't deliver on this, they're never going to give us any more money. Hello, do we understand what's going on here? But think through the rest of the implications. When you keep cutting and cutting and cutting the money that comes into government, then that means, just like you say, we end up with staffers who can't afford to work for the government. We end up with regulators who can't afford it unless they already made a fortune somewhere else and are completely inculcated in the corporate approach to every issue. So I think what we've got is a system that is functioning great for those at the top and just not functioning for anyone else, not for mid-sized businesses, not for small businesses, not for entrepreneurs, not for working families, not for middle-class families, not for poor families. It's just the rest of America. But here's the difference. I think there are a lot of people who are waking up to that. And whether the issue is Roe that woke them up, whether the issue is climate that wakes them up, whether the issue is guns that wake them up. People talk about how Democrats have all these different issues, but in a sense, they all tie back to the same point. They all tie back to where is power in government. And so I'll say it one more time. It's why I'm glad to be here with you. It's why I volunteered to come and help you. This is what I want to do, because we need people in government who are not beholden to the corporate interests and who can take the step back and say it is possible in this system to raise the voices of those for whom this government is supposed to work, for the people, for small businesses, for an economy that's generating opportunity, not just for those at the top, but for everyone. So I think that's what we're about here.
Thank you. And I agree. And it's what I've tried to do my whole career. And this cycle has been extraordinary. I think that we all saw the Citizens United decision 12 years ago and worried about what it would wreak over years to come. I think in some ways, this is the cycle where it's fully blossoming. I mean, it could get even worse, but it's, the outside spending is more robust than it's ever been before.
Yep.
May I ask one more question, or do you have to?
Real quick,
Yeah.
and then I'm going to have to go.
Okay.
They're flagging me that I've got to get on the next call.
30 seconds on inflation.
Sure.
I saw your exchange with Powell. Even he admits that the interest rate hikes aren't going to do anything about energy prices, commodity prices. What do we need to do?
Look, I think of this like somebody just walked into the emergency room and they said, I've got a broken bone. And the doctor rushes in and starts setting the wrist. And the person says, it's my leg. What Powell's got is he's got one tool. And his tool is to raise interest rates. So he's also got a little bit of monetary policy stuff related, but that's not on the table right now. He's got this tool to raise interest rates. And what that tool does is it really dampens business investment. And the idea behind it is to put people out of work and to cut back hours. In other words, make Americans poorer. Now, I think that's a real problem here, because the causes of inflation right now, and I think the economists are finally mostly starting to come together on this, are supply chain problems, problems that COVID is still shutting down various parts of the world that tangles the supply chain again, just when you think you have it unkinked. The war, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine that has driven up energy prices and goes to an issue that you and I talk about on a regular basis, and that is corporate power, where these giant corporations have said, wow, as long as everyone's talking about inflation, let's raise prices an extra margin and just improve our overall profits. Nothing that Powell is doing changes any of those factors that are driving inflation. So I am concerned, and I said it in the hearing, that what's worse than low unemployment and high inflation is that we end up with high unemployment and high inflation, because they're moving two different parts. And I'm concerned about Powell potentially tipping the economy into a recession. So the good news is, this is a place where, because of much of the work you and I've done on personnel as policy, we've got good people on the ground who are dealing with supply chain, who are dealing with COVID, and who are fighting back against the price gouging. Go get them, Lena. And I think over time, it's going to start to bring the inflation problem under control. I just hope the Fed doesn't create additional economic problems before we get there. So that's where I am on this. So I got to run right now. Can I say something to everybody who's joined us today, David, just before I leave?
Yes,
I really do want to say how grateful I am that David agreed to run for public office. It's a lot easier not to get out there in front, but David is someone who has worked really hard on these issues for a very long time. He's a person of principle who knows what he fights for, and he's a person with courage, which we could use a lot more of in Washington. For everybody who's on this call, keep in mind that he runs against people who get a lot of money from big corporations, directly or indirectly, who would be a lot happier with one of his opponents. So please, you've come here today, do what else you can. Dig a little deeper, pitch in a little more. Campaigns are expensive, and the way that we get elected representatives who will represent the people is for people to support them. So please do what you can. And David, good luck in this, and call on me again. I'm here to help.
Will do. Thanks so much for your support, and moreover, the work you do every day. And in moments like this, I know it's giving hope to so many people, not just as an abstraction, but because they see what you're doing, what you stand for, and what you're achieving.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Morris.
That was so. It's a hard task to follow up Senator Warren, but if anyone can do it, it's our next speaker here, the Chief Political Officer at Democracy for America, Chris Scott, is going to come in with a few words.
Well, I'm glad you started the way you did, Morris. Having a follow-up Senator Warren, I think this is the second time I've had to do this on a candidate call, and always huge shoes to fill. But look, David is somebody who Democracy for America is very familiar with. What I love about him is that he is not new to the fight that we face today. I really can't emphasize enough of how much we need people that are willing to be unapologetic and actually fight and show people that it's not always even just the success you get, but people at this time in America really want to know that you're going to have their back, that you're going to stand up for the issues that matter. And so every part of David's career, he has done that over 2 decades of service, whether or not it's working at the city council level, whether or not it's being in the state house. And to bring somebody to Congress like that understand what it's like to have that everyday connection, to have those kitchen table issues that keep you up at night or keep you from even eating your food at the table because you have so much on your mind. That is what David encompasses. So Democracy for America was very, very excited to jump on board this race. It's even better that we get to do it with a lot of the partners that we love, Working Families Party, Senator Warren, Our Revolution, the list can go on. But I think when you look at those endorsements that he has, there's a reason why he has all these people backing in him. And for a time like this, he is the type of champion that we need in Congress. He is a perfect person to add to this progressive class. We're talking about folks that we saw in Greg Kasar, Jasmine Crockett, Summer Lee, people that are true to this fight right now and understand what it means to actually advocate for working families and working people every single day. So I can't emphasize enough, David, thank you so much for stepping up to run. And we are incredibly proud to stand with you on this journey. And let's make sure we finish this thing and get you to Congress so you can start bringing the change that we really need in Washington so desperately right now.
Thanks so much for your support and for your partnership as an organization over the years. I've been working with you guys for, 12, 14 years on various issues, and really appreciate everything you do and your involvement in this race. Okay, and I think now we are moving on to our panel discussion with several esteemed guests, many from Rhode Island and some from across the country who work on some of the issues that Senator Warren and I touched on earlier. I don't have a sense. Can everybody see all of the panelists, and how do I learn whether or not this is the case? And
I'm going through. I think you should all be.
I think Rachel might not be yet.
Yeah, got Rachel.
Okay, so I don't know how we're going to do this, but in the next 15 minutes, we're going to talk about every facet of corporate power and predation over our society from a variety of different vantages. I'll do some quick intros. I think folks are going to talk quickly about their vantage on these issues and then we'll do another round and talk about some opportunities for solutions. But I think people should also feel free to talk and try to have a dialogue as much as possible. So we have Raul Carrillo, who is a scholar of money and the banking and finance systems. We have Tom Roberge, who's the owner of Riffraff, which is a bookstore nearby in Providence, who has experience being a bookseller while under the thumb of Amazon in other contexts, to make that far too hard. Astra Taylor is an activist and author with a really broad remit, but whose work over recent years is focused largely on the for-profit college industry. Cory Doctorow is an activist and journalist and author, and I should say everybody's here in their personal capacities, but Cory is also a special advisor to the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the author of more than 20 books. Jason Rathod is a plaintiff's attorney who works on matters related to corporate power and abuses by large corporations. And Rachel, we all met earlier. She is a member of the City Council in Providence, my City Council member in Providence, and a longstanding labor organizer. And so Raul, do you want to speak a bit to, I think you're going to talk about inflation and the impacts that corporate power has on the dynamics that we're facing today.
Sure thing. Thanks, David. It's great to be here. Folks, as David mentioned, I'm a scholar of law and finance at Yale Law. I was going to set the scene a little bit, but I think the senator has already done that. Just to recap on basic principles, our approach to inflation right now is not hard-headed. The Fed attempts to control the system by managing one price, the federal funds rate, and this doesn't really encapsulate what's happening in the economy. The idea that we can use the central banking system to push and pull on businesses in a very indirect way has not been successful. It hasn't played out as concretely as the Fed thinks, or as other people who support the Fed has thought. As the senator mentioned, what often happens with these interest rate policies is that tight credit adds to business costs. They pass this on to consumers in the form of higher prices. They pass this on to workers by firing them, especially the last hired, first fired. That's folks in vulnerable communities. But what's most important, I think, to realize here is that these prices are all administered. They're managed. They don't just go up, right? This is a function of corporate power. And right now, we are not structurally or politically equipped to handle this sort of price instability in the way that we should. There's much we can do. There's a lot we're not doing. And as the senator mentioned, we're likely headed into a recession. The Fed's policies are going to make things worse. There's no forthcoming fiscal response. Supply chains are going to weaken. There's also going to be increased pressure on households because they have to pay more for energy, for food, et cetera. And that means that demand is also going to have a problem. So in a basic macroeconomic sense, we're headed into a bad place. And in the vacuum of a policy response, corporations are going to raise prices. They're always managing prices. They're always planning things. Those are the central planners. And what's going to happen is the impact is going to hurt, again, the most vulnerable people in society, but all of us. David's history of fighting corporate power, and especially with concrete campaigns, I think is incredibly important here. We can identify particular industries that are abusing the current situation. Again, that includes energy and food, but also pharmaceuticals, housing, and even telecoms, which David has a history of pushing back against in various ways. There are a number of responses. I imagine we'll get into a few of these during the conversation, but as the senator mentioned, and as David mentioned, there's efforts to stop price gouging, unfair manipulation of prices. Lena Khan leading that effort on the federal level. Zephyr Teachout offering an example of a state that can do this in New York. There are all kinds of options for various credit regulations that are on the books, notwithstanding today's ruling by the Supreme Court. And then there's a sense in which now is precisely the time to rethink the black box of corporate power and how we structure businesses and whether workers have voices, et cetera. Two folks in my world that are working on that, James Fallows Tierney in Nebraska, Lenore Palladino at UMass Amherst. This is a chance for economic democracy, which has long been a goal of David's. And right now, we need those champions to push through the fog, or it's not going to happen. Very simply, people are willing to punt to the status quo, where we rely on the Fed to tug on one price to influence the system. I've watched David fight corporate power for a long time, and now is really the moment for someone to concentrate our power. And for that, we need not just a director or a manager, but a leader. And David builds coalitions, David inspires people, and I'm very much looking forward to him being a member of Congress and continuing to work with him.
Thank you, Raul. I really appreciate all of that, especially the high praise. Others should feel free to relate my work back to the conversation or not. I appreciate it. These are issues I've been able to work on over the course of the last several years. But it's a broader conversation too. And I think that there's an opportunity to, how should I say this? I'm just very awkward at receiving praise. Thank you, Raul, for saying all of that. Tom, I wanted to highlight your work as a bookseller in the context of Amazon. In some ways, the juxtaposition is interesting because Raul is, of course, speaking to higher prices, and part of Amazon's value proposition to investors is the monopolization of various spaces and the ability to jack up prices by virtue of that over time. One way they've gotten there, ironically, is through predatory pricing, through loss leading that has undercut booksellers like you as they build their own footprint in the industry. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what your experiences have been.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. So I met David last year, God, I don't know, when David Cicilline was doing that report on not just Amazon, but other monopolies, I think Facebook. There was a bunch of technological things. And so, it forced me to really reckon with what it is that Amazon does to a small business like mine, which is, a small bookstore of less than 2,000 square feet in a small town, Rhode Island. And, just how it's actually happened over the course of Amazon's life. And that is always, they never wanted to sell books. They were collecting data from the very beginning. And they sold books because it was a way to get repeat customers, and the products are not fragile. The shipping was relatively cheap, and so they were shipping this thing that they could just warehouse wherever, was never going to go bad. And in the meantime, they were collecting all this data, and then they built up the web services and all this sort of stuff. And Bezos never had any interest in books, but it did, of course, severely impact the bookselling industry. So much that it even drove a large corporation, Borders, out of business. And what it does for a small bookstore like mine is the fundamental sort of value of what I sell is completely undercut by the fact that you can go to Amazon and buy it for 30, 40% cheaper. And sure, there are plenty of community members, at least around here, who care to support the local business and understand that their money is going back into this, local economy. But a lot of people don't care about these things, or Amazon has done such a good job of sort of incentivizing the repeat purchase and making it easier and easier, all without, employees, and all while treating their employees terribly, that it drove a lot of independent bookstores out of business over the last 20 years. And there's been a little bit of a resurgence, but to say that it is what it was 20, 30 years ago is just insane. It's just, all of us that are still selling books are doing it despite Amazon. And the idea that we can actually combat them in any meaningful sense as Amazon exists currently is almost impossible. We live in a world in which Amazon is the predominant book retailer in the world. And that's all there is to it. All I can do is try to convince people, which sucks, frankly, try to convince people of the inherent, artistic, intellectual value of what they're buying from me and the ways that it actually helps local economies. I pay taxes, Amazon doesn't. I pay my employees a living wage, Amazon doesn't. Like, all of these little things that actually matter that people are spending their money on. And let's be frank, Astor would testify to this. The people who write these books deserve to get paid. I mean, they take years to write, and everyone down the line deserves to be paid. And what Amazon has done over the years is sort of devalued this essential product, this artistic product, in a way that both hurts the industry itself, the value of the book, but then also hurts the individual retailers for whom their books, most people who get into book selling do it because they care about books. No one gets into it because they want to just sell a product and they just happen to sell a lot of books. They do it because they care. And to have someone like Bezos come around and just mine customers for data and be able to do the loss leading is really damaging for the country. And now, to go back to what Senator Warren was saying about taxes, they don't pay taxes. They're flush with all this money to keep being able to do this loss leading, and they're going to keep doing it until somebody steps in and stops them. Whether that's forcing them to pay taxes, whether that's separating out the web services so that that money isn't, going back into the slush fund that allows them to lose money on individual products like books and records and all these other things. Anyway, I've probably taken too long, but that's my general scope of it.
I think we used to structure the economy in a very different way, and loss leading to a certain extent used to be understood to be an anti-competitive business practice because of exactly the effect it's having on retailers like yourself. We see it in other industries too, and the rideshare industry is one obvious example where there have been efforts over years to devalue and undercut traditional taxis, but also public transportation, other aspects of our infrastructure. And my understanding is now we're seeing prices begin to increase because that's happened to enough of an extent. The market share that Lyft and Uber wield is now substantial enough that they're feeling comfortable beginning to increase prices, which was always part of the plan, or at least their grandest hope and part of their value proposition to investors. So there are potential policy responses to all of these things. Astra, I think you're going to speak more broadly than about for-profit colleges today, but it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. I am so enthusiastic about David Segal being in Congress. So I just, it's very exciting to be here to talk. Yeah, I mean, this touches on every aspect of our life. I've worked on various dimensions of this. As Tom just hinted at, I'm actually an author, a writer. I wrote a book called The People's Platform about how hard it is to be an independent artist in a world of corporate monopolies. But I think here it's just important to remember, because we've been living in the state of constant emergency, the background of the pandemic, for example, and this pandemic that is ongoing. And part of that is because of corporate power, because we actually did manage to, scientists did manage to develop highly effective vaccines, but those are controlled by corporate monopolies, right? There are IP restrictions, not just on the recipe for the vaccine, but on the technology required to manufacture it. And so the world is not being vaccinated at the rate we need. And that imperils all of us, even those of us in the United States who are extremely privileged and have access to booster shots. The fact is that when the world is not vaccinated with mRNA vaccines, right, the most effective type of vaccine out there, that it's going to encourage variants, and this will ultimately come back and impact us. And so even when we think we're the best off, we actually live in a society, and none of us are safe until all of us are safe. And so this is one of the ways, on a profound level, that we're imperiled by corporate power. There's a smaller example of this in COVID tests, which actually only cost a couple of dollars to manufacture, but that's not what we're paying, right? We're paying a lot more than that at the drugstore. Certainly people who have had to use the tests from private companies at airports, sometimes they're charged hundreds of dollars for a test that only costs a couple bucks. And it's interesting to remember that one of the major manufacturers of tests is a company called Abbott. They were in the news recently for destroying, again, this emergency blurs time, but for destroying a lot of their stock, their supply, in part, and that caused cost to rise. Abbott is also the manufacturer of infant formula. They controlled 40% of the infant formula market. And you might remember there was a very dangerous shortage of infant formula that they were implicated in. The last example of this, in other words, every emergency that we're going through is touched by corporate power. The Supreme Court ruling on Roe versus Wade caused a, quote unquote, run on Plan B. Well, it turns out that a private equity firm owns Plan B, and so is set to profit and price gouge off of this now even more essential form of healthcare. So just to, I just wanted to say that to just contextualize the way corporate power is really implicated in everything that we're dealing with in this moment. I see it in my work, not my work, it's my volunteer work. I volunteer with a group called the Debt Collective, where we are trying to organize debtors to kind of be a people's lobby. A lot of our work is on the student debt crisis. And so, as David mentioned, we work a lot with people who have attended predatory for-profit colleges. These are companies that essentially have engaged in a kind of corporate capture. They are able to access federal money. That's where the bulk of their funds come from, in the form of federal student loans. They lobby intensely to keep their predatory business model going. The people in Congress who are the most vocal defenders of these companies that really destroy people's lives under the guise of providing education are, of course, the very people getting the biggest campaign donations from them. And so what we see, there's, the corporatization, the corporate capture of something that is one of the most essential public goods, which is education, and providing a subprime product to the people who can afford it the least. And so we are, embroiled in an ongoing fight that's now lasted something like 8 years to win debt cancellation for people who have been defrauded by these schools. But ultimately, the goal is to regulate them, in my opinion, regulate them out of existence. And it's very hard to do under conditions of corporate capture, under conditions created by Citizens United, where these schools can take all of that money, where, again, schools in quotes, where they can take all the revenue they're getting from students, and instead of putting it into education, putting it into paying off elected officials. And so it's really urgent to have allies in Congress, allies like David. And when I think about David as a future congressperson, the first thing I think of is expertise. David knows how things work. David, you are the person I go to when I want to ask a question about about the mechanics of Congress. I'm so enthusiastic about somebody with your deep knowledge being there. I also think about somebody who's not going to grandstand, but is going to govern and use that deep knowledge to govern. And we really need that. We need someone committed to governing, to getting things done. And if it's not the most, dramatic, it's not just for clicks, it's not just for headlines, but because we are in an emergency, we need to improve people's lives. And yes, we need to build that counterpower to corporate power. So I'm with you. I'm on Team David and honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Astra. And there's so many potential responses to all of these considerations. The suite of different things we could be doing. Of course, we need to look at what I would agree about regulating the private for-profit colleges out of existence. And we also need public option. We need people to be able to afford to go to school in a way that's debt-free, and something we can totally achieve. And similar tactics, public options in other realms, more regulatory scrutiny. These are things that we are capable of doing. We just need the will to actually act upon them. And so thank you for the work that you've done over the years in order to ensure the regulators and members of Congress have that will and make at least some meaningful progress on these issues. Corey, I think, is going to speak to some of the manifestations of corporate power in the tech industry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm a David Segal donor and an Elizabeth Warren donor, so I'm honored to be here and help magnify the reach of my donations. I'm a Canadian who became a U.S. citizen less than a week ago, and I'm very honored to be doing my bit for civic participation here. I'm also a recovering bookseller. I was very heartened to hear Tom's intervention there. But, long after I was a bookseller, I was an internet activist. And it was in that capacity that I met David when he teamed up with my old friend, the dear and departed Aaron Swartz, to help found Demand Progress. And Demand Progress was an exceptional is an exceptional organization because of what Astra just talked about. This idea that you use your deep expertise to locate the levers that you can yank on to make stuff happen, that you can take like a bias toward action and make things go. And, that's what I want to talk about today, because I think that technology has a lot of hidden levers that we tend to neglect. So I'll start by saying that I don't think that there was anything intrinsic to the technology that meant that the internet would have to turn into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. That was a policy choice. And it was a policy choice driven by laws that made it harder and harder for new market entrants, whether that was small companies, nonprofits, cooperatives, or just individual tinkerers, to plug things into those dominant services, to interoperate with them. And the way that those services did when they were starting, the way that Facebook built its user base was not by convincing everyone that they didn't really like the friends that they had on MySpace, so they should just quit and go to Facebook. What he did was he gave them a tool where if you gave it your password and your login for MySpace, you could just hang out on Facebook and it would get all your waiting messages and put them in your Facebook inbox. You could reply to them there. And that way you didn't have to choose between a service you like better. And here's a funny thing we forget. Mark Zuckerberg advertised Facebook in the start as the privacy respecting alternative to MySpace. If you don't want all your data being scraped by Google, if you don't want to be monetized by advertisers, come to Facebook where we will guard your privacy. He was sincere for as long as it went, but as soon as he changed his tune, because he wouldn't let anyone give you a tool that you could use to get your Facebook messages and bring them into some rival service like, say, Diaspora or Mastodon or these other sort of indie web services, you then had to choose. Do you like your grandmother or your customers or your community or the people who have the same rare disease as you who you talk to every day on Facebook more than you hate Mark Zuckerberg? And if the equilibrium is wrong, then you end up getting stuck there. So interoperability is an area where we can liberate people and make giant material changes in their quality of life. And this is an area where I think David combines a technical expertise in digital technology with a technical expertise in the technology of state and the way that our apparatus works, where he can help make the kinds of interventions like, say, the Access Act that's working its way through Congress right now that will enable us to shrink down and make manageable those tech companies, instead of the kinds of things that we're seeing from some of the Republicans in Congress who are like, well, the problem with Mark Zuckerberg is he's not nice enough to Donald Trump, right? The problem isn't that we have a social media czar, unelected, self-appointed, who governs the lives of 3 billion people. The problem is we have the wrong social media czar. And I think David is fully on board with abolishing the job of Mark Zuckerberg, right? The problem isn't that Mark Zuckerberg is uniquely unsuited to doing the job he has, although Mark Zuckerberg is uniquely unsuited to doing the job he has. The problem is no one should have that job. And I think that David is the kind of person who is there to abolish Mark Zuckerberg, to abolish big tech, and to understand that the problem isn't the fact that we have ways to talk to each other and organize that are unprecedented in human history, but rather that these have been gathered into the hands of a small number of firms who don't use technology, but rather use the apparatus of state to suppress others from entering the field and doing unto them as they did unto the firms that dominated the internet when they came along. And so that we can hope for better than just picking one of the giants and hoping that it will deal with us more kindly than the other giants, to move into the walled garden of Apple in the hopes that Apple will treat us better than the walled garden of Google or the walled garden of Facebook or the walled garden of Microsoft. We don't need better feudal warlords. We need no warlords of our internet. So thank you, David, for this chance to speak, and good luck with your election campaign.
Thank you, Corey, and thanks for all of your work to illuminate these issues and to popularize them over years. I mean, you've been an inspiration to me and to Demand Progress. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Jason is a plaintiff's attorney. I think that he's going to speak to some of the manifestations of monopoly power on and outsized corporate power and anti-competitive practices more generally on workers, which are substantial and are getting more attention with the new FTC and DOJ.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. And it's my honor to be here and to support you. I'll be quick here because I know we're kind of running short on time, but there's really two issues that I wanted to focus on with respect to corporate power, antitrust, and workers. The first is non-compete agreements. And basically, as the title suggests, it's the ability of a company to restrict a worker from working for a competitor. Over 30 million workers across the country are bound by non-compete agreements. That's probably an underestimate. These are essentially what we call in the law contracts of adhesion. There's an inherent power imbalance between the employer and the worker, and so they're offered on a take it or leave it basis. The workers are basically foisted on them. They have no ability to negotiate. And the effects are really dramatic and awful. I mean, they coerce workers to stay at their workplaces when they could potentially work for a competitor and earn more, gain better benefits, just have a better livelihood. And these really hamper the ability of workers to do that. So non-compete agreements is one issue I wanted to focus on. And I know David has been an outspoken advocate on this issue. He was also a big advocate for getting Lina Khan to head the FTC, and this has been on her radar and was part of a executive order from President Biden that directed the FTC to look into this more. And so I look forward to David getting elected and working further on this issue. The other issue I wanted to focus on was arbitration agreements and employment contracts. So traditionally, workers had the right to go to court to make their case heard, but employers, starting as early as the 1990s, employers and big business, through a concerted effort by the Chamber of Commerce, effectively colluded to craft this extrajudicial system of dispute resolution that they could put workers, consumers, and others into a system of bilateral arbitration. So in the fine print of these employment contracts, it says that employees, you have to go through this dispute resolution. You can no longer have your day in court. And it's not just that it's arbitration, but it's a system of bilateral. So there's a prohibition on collective action, prohibition on class actions. So you can no longer band together workers, consumers for collective accountability. Rather, you have to go one by one. And that effectively just makes it impossible to enforce a wide swath of laws, including wage theft laws, anti-discrimination laws. And before you could have a class action or something to change that practice, but now you have to go kind of one by one, and it makes it infinitely more difficult. There's a piece of legislation that passed the House, the Arbitration Fairness Act. And so I think everyone is hopeful that the Senate one day could take it up, and that in the future there could be action on this issue. And I think David will be a leader on this, both from the legislative side, but there's also hope from regulators such as the CFPB and others that they could take pieces of this and hopefully move away from this system.
Yep, thank you for your remarks and for your work on all of these issues over the years. And the non-compete situation is just extraordinary, where fast food workers are forced to sign non-competes, which limits their options to agitate for higher wages. It dampens the ability to engage in the new organizing that we've been seeing sweep the country. We've got some recent successes in Providence around food service and retail workers organizing, some other moments where they've come up just short. But knowing that your options are going to be limited on the other side of an organizing effort means that you're much less likely to agitate for better wages or for your fundamental right to form a union. And it's really important that these matters be addressed, and I'm hopeful that they're going to be, given some of the folks who are in place at these agencies now. And finally, we have Rachel, my city council person, to speak about the perspective on corporate power from the vantage of a municipal official, which is something that I learned about the hard way 20 years ago. And I think is even more arduous now that our society has become even more, winner take all. We see the Amazons of the world. 15 years ago, it was Boeing asking cities and states to offer proposals for how much tax money they're going to concede or how much public money they're going to put into infrastructure to support one of these behemoths moving to town or to prevent one of them from moving away. So Rachel, it'd be great to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, also thank you, everyone. This is a remarkable group of people. Number one, it's a really old story. It's an argument that corporations make in excellent economic times and harsh economic times. This make me an offer, right? That David just described, where corporations are essentially saying, I will stop doing business here. We will build this or we won't, based on corporate subsidy with public tax dollars. And I think that's an old story. I think it's an insidious one. I think that we don't, the promise is jobs, or it's increased tax base, or it's, a variety of things that many fall short from the promise or the actual dollar invested in public money. And then the other side of it is, what we see happen when we're prioritizing large corporations with public money, and we still see depressed wages, declining wages. We are putting those corporations in competition with local business, like Tom was saying. We're bringing in corporations that manufacture and produce and support practices that Jason just described, right? Like it's insidious and it's ugly and it's old, and it happens over and over again, in cities and towns and states across the country.
Thank you, Rachel. I remember I think GTech was the first one of these that that I faced, where they threatened to move Massachusetts to move unless we offered them a 20-year tax break. And it's really come to define corporate governance and so-called economic development in cities and states across the country. And it's getting even worse because the economy's become less horizontal and more concentrated, and the loss of one of these big firms, or the potential to gain them, depending on your perspective, is so profound that it forces lawmakers into a game where there's just no possibility of winning. So thank you for your work standing up on this issue and on so many others, and all of your work on workers' rights over the years as well. And so I think we should probably call it a day. We've gone over an hour. We were going to go 45 minutes. We've, of course, barely scratched the surface of these issues. But I think that we can at least conclude that corporate power, outsized corporate power, defines nearly every facet of our economy and is warping our democracy against the interests of everyday people. And I think with the right people in place, we can deliver a fairer economy and society to those who so desperately need it. And these priorities will be a priority for me. That was not quite how I meant to. These issues will be a priority for me if I'm so fortunate as to be elected to office, just as they've been over the course of my 20 years of doing organizing and as a lawmaker. And I think there are some real opportunities to get things done through legislation, through pressure on the executive branch and otherwise. So thanks so much for speaking to these concerns today. And Morris, I think we'll invite you back to the stage.
Yes, I will add myself to the spotlight stage here. And as David said, thank you all so much for coming, and I want to thank the panelists again on behalf of the campaign for doing this. And we actually have at midnight tonight a huge end of quarter deadline. It'll be the last end of quarter deadline of the primary campaign. Our fundraising numbers become public after this deadline, and so as Senator Warren said earlier, it's a hard thing to run for office in general. Particularly hard when you're not taking corporate PAC money, when you're not taking fossil fuel money. And so it's all grassroots donations. We're very close to hitting our goal here for this quarter. So I've dropped the link in the chat a few times. People can go chip in whatever they can, share the link with family and friends, anyone else interested. It makes a really, really big difference. And so thank you all so much for coming and joining us for this on a Thursday afternoon, and thank the panelists. And yeah, please chip in and continue to support the campaign.
Thank you all.
Yeah.